My name is Dory DeLeon, and I apologize for the technical difficulty in starting the seminar today. I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about the FDA final rule on food importers, foreign supplier verification programs, or FSVP. The FSVP regulation is going to play an important role in the risk-based prevention-oriented approach to food safety that the FDA is establishing, consistent with the 2011 FDA Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. FSVP really truly is significant because for the first time it requires importers to take specific steps to help ensure the safety of the food that they import. I want to give you a little bit of background on the rule itself and where we are in the process. In FSMA, Congress required food importers to perform risk-based foreign supplier verification activities and directed FDA to adopt regulations on the contents of the FSVPs. Now, we issued the proposed rule on FSVPs in 2013, and in 2014 we issued supplemental proposal that included several changes in response to some of the more than 300 comments we received from various stakeholders. After considering these comments further, we finalized the rule in November of 2015. Now let me go over some of the key principles of the FSVP rule. As I said earlier, the final rule does for the first time require most food importers to take responsibility for ensuring the safety of the food that they import. And consistent with our other FSMA rules, FSVP is designed to be risk-based because it takes into account the different types of hazards, the different types of importers, and different types of suppliers that there are. As I'll discuss in more detail later, the rule gives flexibility to the importers in meeting the requirements to accommodate a more modern and global supply chains. And it does this by allowing importers to rely on activities conducted by others. Now, the rule is very closely aligned with the supply chain provisions of the PC regulations, and that's to avoid imposing redundant requirements and to ensure a level playing field for domestic and foreign suppliers. And one thing I do want to emphasize today is that except for the requirements that the FSVP importer identify itself at entry, FSVP will not change the entry procedures that we have right now. The rule doesn't require verification of FSVP compliance at entry or documentation of a supplier's compliance with applicable regulations at entry. So what we will do is we will be inspecting importers as part of our overall food safety compliance oversight program. So the regulation requires importers to develop FSVPs that provide assurances that their foreign suppliers are using processors and procedures that provide at least the same level of public health protection as is required under the PC and the produce safety provisions of FSMA. This standard allows flexibility, consistent with our trade obligations, for a foreign supplier to use a different procedure than specifically required under the PC or produce safety regulations if it provides the same level of public health protection. Now, FSVPs must also provide assurance that the foreign supplier's food is not adulterated and is not misbranded regarding allergen labeling. So who must comply? The importer is the U.S. owner or consignee of a food at the time of entry into the U.S. However, if there is no U.S. owner or consignee at entry, the importer is considered to be the agent or representative of the foreign owner or consignee as confirmed in a signed statement of consent. Now, there are some exemptions from FSVP. These are for firms that are subject to juice or seafood HACCP regulations, and the reason for that is because those regulations already have a verification or importer verification procedures in them. Also, food that is for research or evaluation. Also exempt are foods that are for personal consumption, and alcoholic beverages and ingredients. Now, we do have some additional exemptions from FSVP. And they are if a food is transshipped through the United States to another country, like for example, if it's a shipment of cucumbers that's moving from Mexico to Canada without any processing or being sold in the U.S., food imported for processing and future export, and food produced in the U.S. that it's exported and returned to the U.S. without further manufacturing or processing, or sometimes known as U.S. goods return. Also, meat, poultry, and egg products that are subject to USDA regulation at the time of importation. In the final rule, we aligned the FSVP and the PC supply chain program provisions, as I mentioned earlier. We aligned them even more closely than what we had done in the supplemental notice. And the way we did that is by revising the hazard analysis and the supplier verification provisions so that they are the same to the extent possible and appropriate. We also did this by broadening the circumstances under which an importer who is in compliance with PC is deemed in compliance with most FSVP requirements. An importer that is also a food facility is deemed in compliance with FSVP, except for the requirement to provide identification at entry, when it is in compliance with applicable PC provisions because it has a supply chain program for the raw material or other ingredient it imports, or because it implements preventive controls for the food it imports under PC, or it's not required to implement the preventive control for a food under PC because its customer or a subsequent entity in the U.S. distribution is addressing the hazard in the food, or the importer has determined that the food can't be consumed with the application of a control. And the example we like to give is like coffee beans. And I'm going to discuss a little bit later the parallel provisions for these under the FSVP regulation. So we made some changes in the final rule to the requirements concerning use of a qualified individuals to perform FSVP tasks. We provided more flexibility by stating that a qualified individual is someone who has the education, training, or experience, or a combination of these, necessary to perform a particular FSVP activity. Now, the definition also states that a qualified individual might be, but it doesn't have to be, an employee of the importer. And a qualified individual could also be a government employee, including a foreign government employee. So note also that an individual must be qualified to do the specific activity that he or she is performing. And the qualifications for that might vary. Like, for example, you might have a person conducting a hazard analysis who has a different, they would need a different set of qualifications than a person who's, maintaining records, for example. So rather than require that all FSV records be maintained in English, the regulation requires that a qualified individual be able to understand the language of any records that he or she is reviewing. And FDA may request a translation of these records when we do an inspection so that we understand what the entity is basically doing or what they're making their decisions on. So most importers will be required to comply with the standard, what we call the standard FSVP requirements. So basically that would be to develop an FSVP, to conduct a hazard analysis, to evaluate the risks posed by a food and performance of the foreign supplier. They would have to approve their foreign supplier. They would have foreign supplier verification activities that they would have to do, corrective actions should something go wrong, and they would have to maintain records. However, there's also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of these key activities that the FSVP importer would have to do, and later I'll talk about some of the modified provisions or the modified requirements for depending on the type of importer or foreign supplier that's involved. So first let's talk about the hazard analysis. So importers will be required to analyze the hazards in the foods they import. Specifically, importers will need to analyze biological, chemical, and physical hazards that are known or reasonably foreseeable to determine whether they require a control. we used to, the proposed rule said, had the notice of significance, so we changed that to reasonably foreseeable in terms of the hazard. The importers must consider hazards that occur naturally, hazards that may be unintentionally introduced, or ones that may intentionally be introduced for economic gain. So the final rule builds more flexibility into these provisions by allowing an importer to rely not just on the hazard analysis conducted by a foreign supplier, but on an analysis conducted by another qualified entity, such as an industry association, for example, provided that the importer reviews and assesses that analysis. So if there are no hazards that are requiring a control, the importer doesn't have to evaluate the foreign supplier's performance or the risk posed by the food, and they don't have to determine and conduct supplier verification. The final rule does note that there are several types of food for which an importer might find that there are no hazards that really would require a control. And some of the examples we give would be something like most crackers or dried pasta, some cookies, candy, sugar, soft drinks, and certain jams and jellies. Another of the requirements is the evaluation of the food and a foreign supplier. So in alignment with the PC supply chain provisions, FSVP requires importers to consider certain characteristics of a potential foreign supplier and the risk posed by a food in approving suppliers and determining appropriate verification activities. So in addition to the hazard analysis for the food, an importer must consider the entity that will significantly minimize or prevent a hazard, or verify that a hazard has been significantly minimized or prevented. They also need to consider the foreign supplier's food safety processes, procedures, and practices, and the FDA food safety regulations that would apply to the food and the supplier's compliance with them. Like, for example, if the supplier has been subject to a warning letter or an import alert or other FDA action. The supplier's food safety information, such as results from testing of the foods for specific hazards. So these are the types of things that the importer must consider. Importers must reevaluate the foreign supplier and the risk posed by the food when they become aware of new information about these factors, or at least every 3 years. So as with the hazard analysis that I just talked about, importers may rely on a food and supplier evaluation that's conducted by another qualified entity. The next slide will talk about the supplier verification activities. So in addition to the supplier verification activities, such as on-site auditing or records review, the rule requires importers to conduct certain related activities. Importers must establish and follow procedures to ensure that they receive food from approved suppliers. But the rule also gives importers the flexibility to use unapproved suppliers if needed on a temporary basis when they subject the food to a verification, such as testing it, for example. The use of an unapproved supplier might be appropriate, for example, when there's a situation like an environmental catastrophe in a region where the supplier is located. So as with other requirements, an importer can rely on another qualified entity to implement procedures to ensure the receipt of food from approved suppliers if the importer assesses the documentation of the use in these procedures. So the importer must have a written procedure for the determination and performance of appropriate supplier verification procedures. So based on the food that they're importer and the supplier evaluation, importers will need to determine what activities, so what verification activities they would need to conduct and how frequently they need to conduct them. Possible activities are either on-site auditing of suppliers, sampling and testing, review of supplier records, and other measures determined to be appropriate. The regulation makes annual on-site auditing the default approach when there is a hazard that can result in a serious adverse health consequence or death to humans or animals. But there's flexibility for an importer to perform some other activity and or to do them less frequently or less frequent auditing if the importer can demonstrate that it provides adequate assurance of safety. So as with other requirements, this is very similar in that the final rule gives importers the flexibility to rely on others to both determine and perform appropriate supplier verification activities. So whether the importer conducts the activities themselves or relies on others, it's the responsibility of the importer to review and assess the results of the verification activities. So if the results don't provide adequate assurance that the hazard is being controlled, the importer must take appropriate corrective action, which I'll discuss in a minute. So a little bit more on on-site audits. On-site audits relied on for the purposes of FSVP must be conducted by a qualified auditor. And in the rule, we say a qualified auditor must have education, training, or experience, again, or a combination thereof, necessary to perform on-site audits of foreign suppliers in accordance with the regulation. Now, a qualified auditor could be a government employee, including a foreign government employee, or they could be, but don't have to be, an audit agent of a certification body accredited under FDA's third-party certification regulation. But if such an auditor conducts an audit solely for the purposes of FSVP, the audit is not subject to the requirements of the third-party certification regulations. Like, for example, they don't have to submit the audit report to FDA, which is required for certain audits under that regulation. Now, an audit should consider any FDA regulations that apply to the food and include a review of the supplier's food safety plan, if they have any. If the supplier is in a country with a comparable or equivalent food safety system, the audit may consider that country's relevant laws and regulations. Now, an importer may substitute the results of certain inspections for on-site audits if the inspection was conducted within 1 year of the audit, of when the audit was required. Some examples are if the inspection for compliance with FDA food safety regulation was done by FDA or other federal agencies or state, local, tribal, or territorial agencies, or there was an inspection by a food safety authority in a country with comparable or equivalent system. There are certain importers that may choose to comply, as I mentioned earlier, with a modified FSVP requirements. Basically, only certain verification activities must be conducted, and it applies to certain sections in FSVP, namely Section 1.507, 1.511, 1.512, and 1.513 within the FSVP regulation. I'm going to go through some of those sections in a little bit more detail right now. So the first one here is the requirements for special circumstances. It applies to imported foods that are intended for further processing and for which the hazard will be controlled after importation. And it also applies to foods that are imported in their raw state, but they cannot be consumed raw. And I mentioned coffee, an example, earlier. The importer is not required to conduct an evaluation of the food and foreign supplier or to have verification activities if the importer has identified the hazard requiring the control in the food and the circumstances I just mentioned apply. I will come back to this particular slide in a minute, but first I want to go over the dietary supplements. So most of the FSVP requirements would not apply to importers of dietary supplements and dietary supplement components who set specifications for components and packing under the dietary supplement CGMP regulation and verify that the specifications are met. So really that regulation does contain supplier verification requirements that are tailored specifically to these types of foods. So other importers of dietary supplements finished dietary supplements will need to meet requirements that are similar to the standard requirements, except that the importers aren't required to conduct a hazard analysis, and the verification itself is to provide assurances that the foreign supplier is using processes and procedures that provide the same level of protection as those required under the Dietary Supplement CGMP regulation. Another subset that would be the modified FSVP requirements would apply are very small importers and foods from certain small suppliers. So the regulation does include these in the final rule. So we changed the definition of a very small importer to align with the definition of a very small business in the regulations on PC for human food and animal food, so that an importer can have a very small status for human food, which with the ceiling of 1 million in average annual sales, or animal food, which has a ceiling of 2.5 million in average annual sales, or both. So the small supplier, or the small foreign suppliers covered under these provisions, in alignment with the supply chain provisions under PC, would be qualified facilities under PC, and certain small farms that are considered not covered under the produce safety regulation, and then producers of shell eggs that have fewer than 3,000 laying hens. So all these would be, again, subject to the modified requirements. So what they would have to do is they would need to annually document its very small importer status, or obtain assurance that its supplier meets the criteria as one of the small types of foreign suppliers that I just spoke about. They would evaluate the supplier compliance history, they would approve the suppliers, and again ensure that the food is from the approved suppliers. And the last set that I'll talk about in terms of modified requirements is they're for importers of certain food from countries with food safety systems that FDA has determined to be comparable or equivalent to ours. The agency has, for a few years now, been developing a systems recognition initiative under which we conduct a comprehensive assessment of a country's food safety system. And we do this to determine whether it provides a similar level of protection as that offered under the U.S. system, and a similar level of oversight and monitoring. So to date, we have entered into a systems recognition agreement with New Zealand and Canada, and we are conducting reviews of others. Systems recognition will enable the agency to leverage the resources of other countries to make efforts to ensure the safety of imported food more risk-based and efficient. Now, under the FSVP rule, the certain types of food from foreign suppliers in countries whose food safety systems we have officially recognized as comparable or determined again to be equivalent would not be subject to most of the FSV requirements if certain requirements are met. And so these modified requirements or these modified provisions are really limited to food that is not intended for further manufacturing or processing, including packaged food products and raw agricultural commodities that will not be commercially processed before consumption. So this limitation aligns these provisions with the PC supply chain provisions, which apply to domestic and imported raw materials and other ingredients, but they don't apply to food that won't be further processed. So what do they have to do? Well, the foreign supplier must be under the oversight of that comparable or equivalent food safety system. Their food is within the scope of the official recognition or determination, because not all foods may fall within that recognition. And the supplier is in good compliance standing with the comparable or equivalent food safety authority. Right, so that is a lot of information. So we do recognize that importers will need time to familiarize themselves with the new requirements. So we have built in time to comply with them. So basically the compliance date is the latest of the following three And then when we say 18 months after the final rule, that's basically May 2017. But if the importer's foreign supplier is subject to the PC or produce safety regulations, the importer won't be required to comply with FSVP until 6 months after its supplier must comply with the underlying regulation. So we do realize that this might result in several different FSVP compliance dates for importers, which will depend on the type of food they import and the size of their suppliers. So in order to help industry with this, we realize that the importers are going to need a lot of additional information to clarify some of the requirements. And so we do have and are developing a draft guidance for FSVP, and we'll continue to do so in the next year. In addition, we're also working with a Food Safety Preventive Controls Alliance to develop training materials for industry on the FSVP regulation. We're also, as part of this, we're also, as today's seminar, we're also hosting and participating in several other webinars and meetings that will help to provide information on FSVP and other FSMA regulations to industry and stakeholders. We're also developing what we call an FDA data dashboard, and that's intended to make it easier for importers to obtain the data or the information to conduct their activities under FSVP. So it'll give them information about compliance, information we have of foreign suppliers through our own inspections and activities at the border as well. So again, we will be working closely with industry to help importers come into compliance with this rule. And we have provided a website. If you're not already familiar with it, we do have www.fda.gov/FSMA or FSMA. And what's really neat about the website is it does have a subscription feature. So anytime there is either a new regulation or a new piece or document that will be useful to industry, we will send out sort of an email to let you know that it's out there. And we also have a feature down below that's called a Contact Us. And that's, we've been using that a lot, and we've been getting a lot of questions. It's a really good portal to get your questions in and have the experts at the FDA take a look at your question and to provide a response for you. So I want to thank you for your time today, and I think we do have a little bit of time for any questions that folks may have.
Hi, Dorlise. This is Terry Baboyge back with you. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, excellent. Hey, I want to apologize. I understand that in the beginning nobody sort of heard it for a little bit of time, and I just found that out. So I'm chiming back in for all of you that I appreciate your everybody's patience. For those of you that did not hear me in the beginning, my name is Terry Baboyge, and I'm the president of Perry Johnson Registrars, and I'm here in Troy, Michigan. So thanks so much for everybody attending, first and foremost. And Dorlise, thank you. A great presentation. The slides were excellent. In fact, really, really good stuff. So it was excellent, Dorlise.
Great, thank you. My pleasure.
Now here, can you do me a super big favor, okay, because it's going to be sort of pertinent, a question that I have. Go over to slide 15 if you don't mind. Can you put that back up on the screen?
Sure.
Okay, excellent. All righty.
Let me go to 15. Okay, here we go.
Okay. Now, because for those of you that may be certified, there might be, again, groups of that are certified to the SQF or BRC or FSSC 20, whatever the various standards that are GFSI standards, and some will not be. So I was told, because when we went to the American National Standards Institute visit on Friday, and us being a part of the pilot program, that that there is the regulatory component of this requirement that has to be unannounced audits, and you have to excuse me for the beginning of me not listening into the whole to the beginning, because I sort of missed the beginning. So did you address the consultative audits versus the unannounced audits at all?
Well, the thing about it is I think you're really talking about FDA's third-party accreditation rule, which is
Okay.
a different rule. This is what you're speaking about is in order to have or participate into that program, there is that, that is one of the requirements of that particular rule. It does not apply, and we don't make that requirement in FSVP.
Okay, very good. So, outstanding. Now, also, there are the entities that can also recognize these. You talk about accrediting bodies, third-party certification bodies, eligible entities. Okay, that have the ability. Now, for the sake of this particular meeting, some of the individuals that are on the phone are probably U.S.-based companies. I don't think, even though we have operations all over the world, I don't think we have people that are too much that are outside of the United States for the sake of this meeting. But now, for folks that are importers directly in the U.S., how many of those people do you think are going to take the burden on to do this, or will they cascade this information on to the actual importer that's outside the country? And will you see a percentage of those folks that are here that will take this on?
Well, this particular rule does require that there is a U.S.-based importer. That's the FSVP importer has to be a U.S. entity that takes responsibility for the food. And so it's defined, and I'll put the slide back up so you have it.
Sorry about that.
No problem at all. And so while it's hard for me to tell you sort of what percentages, they would do that, I did want to make sure you saw, I just went too far, that for the purposes of FSVP, we have to find, and it is defined, the importer is the U.S. owner or consignee of the food at the time of entry. So it is that person who is going to be responsible for these activities. Now, they don't have to do the activities themselves. They can rely on someone else, but they will be the ones who will be basically on the hook, if you will, for ensuring that the food is safe and it has and they've complied with the regulation.
So the activity will not be done necessarily on U.S. soil per se. It may be done directly at the point of shipment, say in Japan or whatever it might be, correct? And then they have to
It might be. If they consider that to be an appropriate verification activity, yes. Yeah, it's flexible that it doesn't. It's the activity itself doesn't have to be in one place or the other.
Okay, because I'm just thinking from a cost perspective, from a commercial standpoint, if you have an importer here in the United States, if they have these suppliers that they recognize, okay, and they're going to make sure that they have this ticket to be able to continue to supply them, as opposed to them absorbing the cost of doing the activity. You know what I'm getting at?
Yes.
So that probably will be the case. Okay, excellent. Hey, while we were on the line, Dorlise, I did want to go ahead because the people did not hear a little bit about the ANSI program that we are involved with, because some of the folks that are on the phone may want to get involved with this. So we were at the American National Standards Institute and participating on Friday, and they are working in conjunction with the FDA to be able to roll out a gap assessment program. Okay, and they're recognizing some of the third parties, that being, Perry Johnson Registrars is a third-party provider certification body. So if anybody has interested in this pilot program, please let Lauren Maloney know, and she is at 248-358-3388. We're at the very onset of this program, identifying companies who want to be the first up to be able to do this. Some of the companies now are going to do this individually. They're not going to necessarily do it in conjunction with an SQF or a BRC audit. Now, did you want to comment, Dorlise, a little bit about maybe that component about whether or not this can be conducted along with an FSSC 22000 audit, or did you discuss that? Maybe I missed that.
I did not, and that is not. And again, I think that's more on the third-party accreditation program. I mean, that would be sort of outside the scope of my experience. I apologize.
Sure.
In terms of sort of what what they would have to do. The rule FSVP doesn't make a requirement that it has to be an accredited or certified auditor. They just have to have the experience, knowledge, and education to conduct audits.
Sure.
So it's very flexible in that way, at least for FSVP. It's very different from third party. The third party accreditation rule is very different, but for as it applies to FSVP, that's basically it.
See, what some people may want to do, if they're already getting audits to the FSSC 22000 program or whatever, they'll just have that same auditor who's qualified be able to go out there and approve them, under this program. Do you see? I can see that happening.
That makes sense. I mean, that would make sense, and as long as the importer, reviews or evaluates the information that's received from the audit, they could use it.
Sure. Like from a commercial standpoint, everybody is going to look at it from a standpoint of, hey, how can I, kill two birds with one stone, perhaps, and be able to make this most cost effective. Right. So, okay, I am all set with questions that I have, and I can't thank you enough for everything, Dorlise. Really, it was very, very good presentation.
I just wanted to pose, Terry, I did receive sort of a question that I need a little clarification on.
Okay, sure.
They went ahead. They said it must be prior to bring or received, and I'm not sure what that what the question says. So if the person would go ahead and provide a little bit more detail to the question, maybe I'll be able to address it here.
Oh, okay.
So I might give them a minute or so.
Yeah, we'll give them a couple of minutes.
Type it out if they want to. I'm just not clear of what that is.
No, you're a wealth of knowledge. In fact, I had some one of my individuals sort of chimed in and said it was excellent. So obviously, you're very in tune with everything that's going on with the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and we do appreciate your time. Really, this was excellent.
Glad to hear it. Well, I did get clarification, so let me take a moment to read that.
Okay. All right. Cool.
Okay, so the question really asked whether the activity of approving the supplier is supposed to be done prior to it being received, and the answer to that is yes. Yeah, you would want to conduct your hazard analysis and write that up, and then you would, go through the process of approving your supplier, and you would want to do that before the food comes in as the importer. The importer would do that.
Okay. Very good. Anybody else? Thank you.
So again, I realize, when you receive this much information, you may not, be ready with questions, or may, as you sort of think on the information you've just received, questions might pop up. So I do advise folks to go to the FDA site for FSMA and, to submit or send any questions that you may still have. Again, we are going to be supplying or issuing a guidance document which will help to further explain the information in the regulation and how, how to comply. So, be on the lookout for that.
Okay. Now, Dorlise, are you out of where are you located?
So I'm at the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, which is in College Park, Maryland. We're really down the street from the University of Maryland, and a little bit away, just a few minutes away from the FDA campus at White Oak in Silver Spring, Maryland. Sure.
Do me a super big favor, and I'm going to do this. I know we're online with everybody, but I want you to take my my name and my number down. It's Terry, and the last name is Boboige. And again, I'm the president of PJR globally. And if you could call me at 248-358-3388, I wanted to talk to you about some bullet points of the ANSI pilot program for the GAP.
But Terry, if I may pause you, I write quickly, but that was very fast on your telephone number.
Sorry about that. It's okay. It's 248-358-3388. And yeah, if you could give me a ring, I want to tell you it's pretty exciting. This pilot program is very exciting. It's being launched, and it's really going to affect your side of the operation. So I wanted to give you some information on things that we've got happening on our side, and I think that might be helpful for input we can give you too. So
that's great. We'd love to have that discussion.
Okay, great. Okay, well, with that, I think we need to sign off. Is there anything else? Anybody else has any other questions? Okay, and you have all the contact information there from that last slide, so I think we're all set to that. Right?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time, and I really, really appreciate having this conversation with you today.
Excellent. Okay, now we are going to look, Dorlise, at having this up on our websites for those that did not get a chance to participate. Maybe they can go back up and they can listen to it again, and because there will be people from, I see some of the foreign entities that would not be able to log in with this time zone. So that's going to be good. We'll be able to have it on the website at least for the next maybe short period of time. We'll have it up there.
That's great.
Okay. All right. We're going to sign off. Okay. So
okay. Have a wonderful day.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.